Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Witches Sabbath, an exploration of history, folklore, and modern practice, by Kelden. Narrated by Tegan Ashton Cohan. Disclaimer. The information contained in this book derives from historical and folkloric sources, as well as from personal experience. It is in no way meant to replace qualified medical care, including that provided by mental health professionals. The author and publisher are not liable for any injury or ill effect caused by the application of information provided in this book. Do not ingest poisonous or unfamiliar plants, and take care when handling them. Please use your common sense when utilizing any of the practices discussed, and consult the advice of a trained medical practitioner when necessary. Trigger warning. The following book contains historical and folkloric references to several topics that may be upsetting to some, including mentions of infanticide, cannibalism, and incest. If you are someone who may be triggered by such topics, unfortunately this book will not be for you. Foreword. My first ever witch ritual with other people, or entities, occurred on a midsummer night in the back seat of my father's car. I had gone with my dad and some of his friends to an out-of-town concert on the summer solstice. On the ride home, I closed my eyes and found myself somewhere else. That somewhere else wasn't like the Sabbath, seasonal celebration rituals I'd read about in Wiccan witchcraft books. It was a place full of otherworldly witches and spirits. That elsewhere I visited felt as if it were outside of known time and space, and that the visitors there could have been from any time period or place. Without thinking about it, or really trying to get there, I had visited the legendary Witches Sabbath, a witchcraft experience like no other. Years later, as I began making friends in the greater witchcraft community, I would bring up my experiences in this other world. Some of those witches looked at me in bewilderment, while others nodded along and began finishing my sentences for me. I was surprised to find that other witches had visited the same place I had, and that our experiences were similar. The Witches Sabbath is a topic that comes up a lot in witchcraft books, but it's rarely elaborated upon. Over the last 50 years, it's become fashionable to write about witchcraft in a way that makes it feel safe and wholesome to outsiders. Such descriptions dull the sharp edges of witchcraft down to rounded corners and exclude anything that might make the neighbors uncomfortable. During the era of satanic panic, from the mid-1970s through the early 1990s, perhaps that was an advisable strategy in public spaces, but it makes for a much more boring and less vibrant witchcraft. Hundreds of years ago, those accused of witchcraft were often the most vulnerable and marginalized members of society. Those accused witches, who were predominantly women, were scorned for owning their sexuality, practicing magic, and disrupting the social order. Not everyone accused of witchcraft was executed, but death was a punishment handed out to tens of thousands. Even the simple accusation of witchcraft could have serious repercussions: homelessness, financial hardship, and loss of family and friends. Many of those tortured and accused of witchcraft confessed to attending what would become known as the Witches Sabbath. At the Sabbath, individuals were free to own their sexual selves, indulge in magical practice, dance, feast, and do the other things that make life worth living. Confessions derived from torture are always suspect, but it seems to me that these alleged witches were most certainly going somewhere. The Sabbath was an escape, a place to revel in the idealized self, with everyone else present in that space willing to accept you. There is often a very large disconnect between contemporary witches and those who were executed during the witch trials. Many modern scholars scoff at suggestions that today's craft has origins in the more distant past, but I'm not sure such theories can be discounted entirely. While it's unlikely that there is an unbroken chain connecting my witchcraft beliefs with victims of the witch trials 400 years ago, there are most certainly connections. There was an edge to their descriptions of the Witches' Sabbath, both then and now, an edge that inspires and provokes. And it's undeniable that the stories told about the Sabbath by those accused of witchcraft centuries ago continue to influence our craft today. I have always felt as if witchcraft were a journey and not a destination, and you'll go on a variety of journeys in this book. You'll find yourself connecting to witches of long ago, while also getting swept up in tales about the fair folk, familiar spirits, and even the devil himself. You'll explore numinous Sabbath locations and witness strange dancing and magic-making. There are contemporary stops, too, visits with often overlooked witchcraft pioneers such as Austin Osman Spare and Andrew Chumbley. And you'll come to see just how the Witches' Sabbath came to exist in the modern practices of both traditional witchcraft and Wicca. Beyond history and folklore, Kelden shares the many paths that can take the modern witch on their very own journey to the Sabbath. The elsewhere can be reached by expanding our consciousness, or perhaps softening our mundane minds with an elixir or the legendary witch's ointment. By treading the witch's mill, we can use our physical bodies to help us reach another state of consciousness and a different reality. To be a witch is to traverse the space between the worlds and all who inhabit such liminal spaces. Many who seek the Witches' Sabbath stumble blindly into it, unaware of the space they are entering. There are also those who write about the Sabbath like a closely guarded secret, whispering about the path while refusing to provide a roadmap. In this book, Kelden doesn't just provide a roadmap. He gives you a guided tour. The Sabbath can be accessed by anyone, alone or with friends, regardless of specific tradition or level of experience. The keys to this journey are all present in this book. It's simply a matter of picking them up and having the mind to use them. For some witches, history can be boring, but there's nothing boring to be found in this book. Kelden's The Witches' Sabbath is one of the best witchcraft journeys I've been on in quite some time. The size and scope of the journey are epic, and I believe that this book will make you a better witch. Witches have traditionally always been the others, the people who refuse to conform to society's parameters and are comfortable in their own and other skins. The Witches' Sabbath is a place to indulge in that otherness with others who also embrace it. No matter how you get to the Sabbath, you'll find a home and a power there. It's a journey worth taking. Jason W. Mankey, July 2021. Introduction. On the night of Walpurga, a lone witch approaches their fireplace with a quiet knowing. The embers have cooled and turned to ash, leaving the hearth both still and silent, with the exception of a ticking clock sitting upon the mantel. The hour approaches midnight. Removing the cork from a small clay pot, the witch dips the fingers of their left hand into an ointment that gives off a pungent, earthy aroma. With concentrated movements, the witch rubs the sticky salve onto their wrists, behind their ears, and upon the soles of their feet. Then, mounting a broomstick that had previously been resting against the gray stone fireplace, the witch closes their eyes and utters the words, "Thout, tout-a-tout-tout, throughout and about." and with a whoosh, they are carried up the chimney and out into the night. The wind howls as the witch soars across the darkened sky, an inky black tapestry devoid of the stars and moon, which have been obscured by thick clouds. The witch flies over the tops of houses, where inhabitants sleep restlessly, their heads filled with strange dreams. Farther and farther the witch journeys, over city walls and into the wild countryside where few dare to go. Higher and higher they travel, up the side of a looming mountain that has the reputation of being haunted by ghosts and fairies. Finally, reaching the summit, the witch touches down upon the ground in the middle of a clearing, where others have already started to gather around a roaring bonfire. The boisterous scene that unfolds before the witch's eyes is both awe-inspiring and frightening. Around the fire, which has an unearthly green glow, other witches dance in a ring with their backs to the flames. The strange dance is set to the tune of an eerie song played on flutes and tambourines. Additional witches sit nearby, crafting dolls and mixing powders, preparing these items for the working of spells. Still other witches are gathered around a long banquet table, feasting upon bread and wine. Enthroned, at the head of the gathering is a man dressed all in black. The devil. He watches over the witches as they revel in his honor, each act one of empowerment for both the witches and himself. Shedding all of their mundane worry and stress and casting off their mortal inhibitions, the witch joins the festivities, which will continue until the rooster crows, announcing the arrival of dawn. That story describes the events of what is known as the Witches Sabbath, a nocturnal meeting between witches and the devil. Growing up, I enjoyed nothing more than reading stories about witches, both fictional and historical. A common theme that I came to find in these tales was the idea that practitioners of the craft convened together on special nights in some secret location. Of course, depending upon the source, these meetings ranged from relatively benign to outright diabolical. In one story, the Sabbath could be presented as a quaint, albeit spooky, assembly, while in another it was shown to be barbaric and grotesquely evil. Either way, there was something incredibly alluring about these Sabbath gatherings, something that pulled at my spirit and whispered encouragingly for me to come along. When I first started learning about the practice of modern witchcraft, especially Wicca, I was taught about the Sabbats. In Wicca and some other neo-pagan paths, the Sabbats are celebratory rituals, known collectively as the Wheel of Year, that focus on connecting to deities as they are reflected in the changing seasonal tides. However, while these Sabbats are a contemporary conceptualization, they are based in part on older folklore regarding those same nocturnal witch meetings I had read about as a child. As my personal practice as a witch shifted over the years, and I became more interested in what is known as traditional witchcraft, a non-Wiccan form of craft, I started to reconsider the folklore of the Sabbath and how it could be applied to my modern practice. The book that you are about to listen to is the culmination of my years of research on, as well as my own experiences of journeying to, the Witches Sabbath. It's important to note up front that the material within this book, particularly that relating to modern practice, will be presented through the specific lens of traditional witchcraft. Within traditional craft, practitioners view the Sabbath as an otherworldly gathering of witches and assorted spirits. While there are ways in which the Sabbath can be enacted in physical space, which will be touched upon in Chapter 8, The primary focus of the discussions on modern application in this book will be on the Sabbath as a spectral event, one that requires the solitary witch to travel into the other world. Therefore, while the Wiccan Wheel of Year will be discussed in terms of its relationship to the overarching historical development of the Witches' Sabbath, please be aware that this is not intended to be a book about Wicca, nor the seasonal holidays celebrated within that distinct branch of the craft. That being said, although the chapters pertaining to modern application will be rooted in traditional witchcraft, anyone can make use of the beliefs and practices found therein, regardless of their tradition. The book itself is structured with chapters dedicated alternately to the historical and folkloric background of the Witches' Sabbath and to modern practice. In order to further illustrate the Sabbath's nature, I have included extra sections entitled The Sabbath in Art. As the name suggests, in these sections you'll find examinations of the Sabbath as it has appeared in various forms of art throughout time. Additionally, there are several exercises within the book, including recipes, spells, and rituals that will aid you in your journey to the Witches' Sabbath. At the end of the book is an appendix containing a list of the many accused witches mentioned, including their geographic location and the date they were either tried or executed, for quick and easy reference. Witch Trial Transcripts. In discussing the Witches' Sabbath, I will be frequently citing the confessions of those individuals who were accused of witchcraft across Europe and in the early American colonies. In mentioning these cases, I am in no way attempting to suggest that the accused were actual practitioners of witchcraft. We know today that most confessions were obtained under torture, during which individuals would have confessed to just about anything in order to escape pain and death. Additionally, others were subjected to sleep deprivation and other hostile conditions, under which both their physical and mental health would have rapidly deteriorated. Interrogators were also guilty of using leading questions and other techniques in order to manipulate the narrative to fit their own agenda. Finally, confessions were not always recorded verbatim, and later translations were susceptible to being distorted, sometimes even intentionally so. That being said, while those accused were most likely innocent wholesale, the fact remains that many of the details presented in their confessions, whether given by the accused or inserted by interrogators, reflected pre-established beliefs regarding the practice of witchcraft. Author Emma Wilby notes that when it comes to the confessions given by the accused, we must assume that when crafting their accounts of benign accolere, Sabbath, festivities, suspects drew on the gossip and propaganda surrounding the nocturnal meetings of witches that circulated in the region both before and during the witch prosecution. Thus, confessional statements can be mined as repositories of folk beliefs, in this case those that pertain specifically to the Witches' Sabbath. An examination of trial transcripts allows us, as present-day practitioners, to better understand the ways in which the accounts given by the accused inadvertently influenced the development of modern witchcraft. Additionally, such explorations also provide us with a wealth of lore that can help further inspire our practices as witches moving forward. Countries discussed. In this book, I will be taking a multi-regional approach, discussing the Sabbath as it appeared in various different countries. As noted before, this will include several European countries, as well as the early American colonies. The concept of nocturnal assemblies of witches emerged in many diverse places, and those discussed in this text are by no means an exhaustive list. Certain countries are not mentioned herein, due to either an absence of Sabbath stories or a scarcity of documentation regarding the trials that took place in those regions. As you listen, you may also notice that some countries are talked about at length, while others are only briefly considered. The cause of this discrepancy lies in the amount of details given in certain places, which was smaller in some while larger in others. For example, the accounts of English Sabbaths were quite scanty in comparison to those found in France and Spain. Chapter 1. Stoking the Sabbath Fire. Throughout time and across cultures, there have always been witches, in one form or another, individuals with magical powers that were typically used in order to cause harm to those within the witches' community. Through their wicked words and detestable deeds, witches could bring about illness, blight local crops, or cause other assorted disasters. As such, they have always presented a sort of danger to society at large, a shroud of menace that threatened to poison the daily lives of godly folk. However, for a long time, witches were seen as solitary practitioners who went about their dark arts alone. By the time the first wave of European witch trials started, approximately the 15th century, terrifying ideas had begun to emerge regarding large groups of witches who would fly through the dead of night to diabolical meetings with the devil. These nocturnal gatherings, which would become a central element in many trials, involved a host of nefarious activities, such as demon worship, casting of spells for harm, feasting on the flesh of infants, and wild orgies. This coming together of witches and the devil has been referred to by many names throughout history and folklore, from generic terms such as assembly to more specific ones such as synagogue. However, the name that has stuck the longest, and that which people are most familiar with today, is Sabbath. From a modern vantage point, the Sabbath is a relatively tidy, well-defined construct, like an intricately woven tapestry full of rich detail. But, like a tapestry, the imagery of the witch's Sabbath was woven out of many disparate threads, and that was a process that occurred gradually over time. Much to the chagrin of researchers, myself included, there is no clear point of origin for the witch's Sabbath, no distinct moment in time when the concept was sparked into existence. Despite its unknown exact moment of creation, the notion of the witch's Sabbath emerged during the Middle Ages from a mixture of ecclesiastical ideas regarding demonology, fused with elements of early paganism that had been preserved in popular folklore. Rather than being a monolithic entity, in the beginning, the Sabbath was more of a loose framework upon which assorted regional and cultural elements would be added over time. The end result, and what we are left with today, is vividly detailed stories regarding witches gathering in the night to work their evil spells and pay homage to the devil. But in order to have a well-rounded understanding of these tales and the role they play in today's practice of witchcraft, we must determine how their basic structure was first composed. To do so, it will be necessary to dismantle the narrative as it's known today and to examine all the individual parts. Thus, to truly comprehend what would become known as the Witches' Sabbath, we must start by pulling out the threads of history and folklore and unravel the tapestry altogether. Etymology of the Witches' Sabbath. It is often said that knowing the true name of something gives you power over it. Whether or not this is true, knowing the origins of a word certainly gives you valuable insight into what it describes. Thus, before we become fully immersed in its developmental history, it will serve us well to examine the specific etymology of the word Witches' Sabbath. The word Sabbath is one that has long been associated with both Judaism and Christianity, specifically referring to their holy day of the week. The word derives from the Latin sabbatum, the Greek sabbaton, and the Hebrew Shabbat, all meaning day of rest. Traditionally, this period of rest occurred on the seventh day of the week, or Saturday. According to the book of Genesis, it was on the seventh day that God rested after he finished creating the world. But this only begs the question, how did a term that's been classically used to describe a holy day for both Jews and Christians come to be associated with the gathering of witches? The specific term, Witches Sabbath, is actually of quite obscure origin and, to this day, a secure provenance remains absent. One of the earliest documented uses of the term Sabbath, in connection to witches, reportedly occurred in the trial account of a French woman, Jeanne Gourmet, in 1446. 16 years later, in 1462, the term Sabbath again appeared in Petrus Memoris's Flagellum Maleficorum. However, the use of Sabbath as a name for gatherings of witches wouldn't become popularly used until the late 16th century and onward. Prior to this, witch meetings were referred to by many other names, including assemblies, convents, and synagogues. The use of the latter term, which has historically been used to describe congregations of Jewish people, reveals an early prejudiced belief that Judaism was a form of both heresy and witchcraft. And, as will be seen shortly, the persecution of Jewish people during the early Middle Ages actually played a key role in the budding development of the Witches Sabbath narrative. An additional explanation for the use of the word Sabbath to describe gatherings of witches was hinted at by the French jurist and political theorist Jean Bodin. In his influential 1580 book, De la Démonomanie des Sorciers, Bodin wrote that Saturday was a day sanctified by God. But, in a strange twist, it was also on this night that God supposedly gave permission to evil spirits to chastise and harm people. Bodin went on to add that Saturday belonged to the planet Saturn, which was long held to possess malefic powers. It is of interest to note, as Bodin pointed out, that the Hebrew word for Saturn is Shabtai, which itself is associated with the word Shabbat or Sabbath. However, as we will discuss in Chapter 3, the date of the Witches' Sabbath was highly varied, and its occurrence was by no means exclusive to Saturday nights. Yet another prominent suggestion has been that the Witches' Sabbath as a whole was an inverse, or at least partial inverse, of the Christian faith. In this case, it would appear that the particular date didn't matter as much as the specific diabolical events that took place therein. It was those details that were most interesting to the persecutors and writers of the time. In this sense, the term Sabbath was used rather liberally to describe any coming together of witches, regardless of the specific day of the week. And by the late 16th century onward, Sabbath became the common word used to denote these sorcerous convocations. Early accusations. As we embark on our exploration of the historical development of the Witches' Sabbath, we must start with a discussion on a rather surprising topic: the accusations made by Roman pagans against the early Christians. During the 1st century and onward, as Christianity began to grow, the Roman people viewed its practices with a great deal of suspicion. Out of those suspicions, whispered rumors and accusations started to circulate. It was said that Christians regularly came together in the night to participate in 3 unforgivably heinous acts: infanticide, cannibalism, and incestuous orgies. Out of all possible crimes, those 3 were likely cited in particular due to ways in which they are monstrously antithetical to both civilized humanity and nature itself. There is reason to believe that those damaging stereotypes were already in place by a...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?